So I come from a political family. My grandfather was a communist and a trade unionist, so I grew up in a very left-wing household. And I decided relatively early on that I was very interested in politics and economics. I went on to study politics, philosophy and economics at Oxford. I was really surprised by how little I learned about the way the economy actually worked, especially in my economics course. I spent so much time doing kind of differentiation and integration and looking at graphs and mathematical models. And I very quickly realized that I wasn't learning the real intricacies of the way that a capitalist economy works. This was a few years after the financial crisis of 2008, we learned very little about the financial system, about the way money works, about lending, about the dynamics of kind of trade and investment between different parts of the world. So I came out of that, I would say, pretty skeptical about the economics profession. I then went on to do a master's in African studies. And what I found fascinating about that was I was learning about the global economy from the perspective of those at the bottom, whereas PPE, this degree at Oxford, that all of our prime ministers have done, it basically teaches you how the world economy works from the perspective of those at the top. So when I flipped that around and began to see the dynamics of extraction, expropriation, colonialism, the ways in which all of those continue to this day through a financial system centered in the City of London that continues to extract from the global south, it made me really rethink a lot of what I had learned in my undergraduate degree. I was already pretty skeptical, but after doing that African studies degree, I realized that I had not learned very much about the way that capitalism really worked. And that was when I started to get really interested in Marxism, actually. I had studied a number of thinkers from within the African independence movement, different parts of the Pan-African movement who had been inspired by Marxism. People like Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara. And that was when I really started to get into these global understandings of capitalism, of imperialism, of extraction, of monopoly power. And it just made so much more sense to me based on the things that I had learned. And from there, it was really all downhill or uphill, depending on your perspective. I went to work in a think tank in economic policy in the UK, worked relatively closely with the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, thinking about how to transform the UK economy. And again, a lot of what we were proposing in terms of things like wealth taxation, a national investment bank, greater investment in public services and social infrastructure, these were not radical things, but because of the kind of rigidity of the economics profession, which is so wedded to these ideas about capitalism being a free market competitive system, they were all dismissed out of hand. And, I was wheeled out to defend these ideas in the media, sometimes to success, sometimes not. So, all through my career, I've really been studying economics and economists from the outside, like looking inwards into how this discipline works. What are its mythologies? What are its kind of sacred ideas? And how can we think about challenging those by looking at the global economy from a different perspective, looking at it from the perspective of those who are, as I said, at the bottom rather than those at the top? The argument I make in Vulture Capitalism is that capitalism is not a free market competitive system. So from its very origins, capitalism has been a system based on monopoly power. So the absence really of free markets when we're talking about production in the corporation, and also deep and extensive collaboration between the public and private sector. Now you see this throughout the economy today. We can see it, all the examples I use in the book. The case study that I use at the start is that of Boeing, this big aerospace company which has been, really caught in all sorts of corporate scandals in recent years. And in the book I look at the ways in which it wasn't just kind of an extractive corporate model that was oriented towards shareholder value that caused those scandals. That was a big part of the problem. But the only reason the firm was able to get away with it was because it operates in an oligopolistic market structure and because it has extremely close links to the American state. And you see this replicated across much of the economy, especially at the kind of what Marx would call the commanding heights of the economy, i.e. The corporations that are producing the most critical inputs to production. You see it in tech, you see it in pharmaceuticals, in agrochemicals, in much manufacturing, that, these are not free markets, they are oligopolistic market structures, and there is just very, very deep cooperation and collaboration between these corporations and the state. And this, as I said, goes back all the way to the origins of capitalism. There is a quote in my book. It was Edmund Burke talking about the East India Company, and he said that it was a strange absurdity that this company existed because it was a market in the guise of a state. The East India Company was this collaboration between a bunch of merchants and the British state with a view to projecting the British Empire into the Indian subcontinent. And this model was replicated, in the Dutch East India Company, various other similar models. So you can see from the very origins of capitalism that the corporate form was not this kind of nice free market structure that just emerged out of spontaneous trading between individuals. Instead, it was always founded on pretensions to monopoly, to market dominance, and also very deep collaboration between the merchant class and the state. And that, I would argue, is a fundamental feature of capitalism, and it continues to this day. In the book, I argue that because capitalism is not a free market system, we need to think about it more as a system of kind of domination and control. So basically, those who control capital, who control the means of production, are able to take decisions that affect everyone else's lives, and they do so with little accountability, either from the market or from democracy. In the same way, our political class is insulated to a great extent from democratic accountability due to the close links between the public and private sector. So my argument is, capitalism isn't defined by free markets. It's defined by kind of domination and control, by the centralization of power and authority. So the opposite of that system is not, as some people argue, kind of state socialism, like the Chinese model, for example, where you have even closer collaboration between big government and big corporations in pursuit of profit and economic growth. Instead, I argue that the opposite of this system is decentralization. It is actually handing power back to ordinary people and allowing them to work together to take the decisions that will, determine the future of our society. And I have a few examples in the book just to show what that looks like on a very small scale, because really you only, in the current system, get these small little experiments cropping up every now and again that show you what a different world might look like. Often they're crushed, they're not allowed to succeed, but they do show you kind of the alternative to this model of kind of centralized authoritarian planning. And the example I really like, because it's very elegant, is the example of Lucas Aerospace. Now, I contrast Lucas Aerospace with Boeing. Boeing obviously having been implicated in, the 737 MAX disasters, 2 planes nosediving out of the sky. The senior executives within that firm knew about the problems with that plane before it went to market. And Boeing had really moved towards a very centralized corporate structure where the unions had been crushed within the firm. There was a lot of layers of management all directed towards maximizing shareholder value, and again, very close relationships with the American state. It's kind of like an archetypical model of what can go wrong with this model of unaccountable centralized capitalist planning. And the alternative to that is the example that I use of Lucas Aerospace, which was an aerospace company in the UK in the 1970s. Workers at that firm realized that the firm was in trouble. It was facing competition from abroad, and they went to the government and said, look, we need you to nationalize us, otherwise we're all going to lose our job. One of my favorite politicians, Tony Benn, who was then the Minister for Industry, replied to them by saying, we can't nationalize you. Why don't you go away and come up with a plan as to what you would do with this firm if you could? Now, everyone was very skeptical about the capacity of the workers within this firm to decide what they should be producing. And actually what you ended up seeing is this astonishing document that was put together called the Lucas Plan, based on ideas that had been generated just by the workers within this corporation. And what they said was, we don't want to be producing weapons anymore. We want to be producing socially useful technologies. So yes, aerospace, useful, engineering innovations, but also things like kidney dialysis machines, like wind turbines. They were really committed, the workers in this firm, to the idea that they wanted their labor to be used for something useful, for something socially beneficial. It came to fruition in the form of the Lucas Plan. There were a number of politicians who really pushed to allow this to happen, basically to allow the workers to take control of the company. Thatcher ultimately came to to power and crushed the Lucas plan. And it was sold off in the shareholder value revolution of the 1980s, chopped up into all these little pieces. And the thing I discovered during my research is that a part of what was once Lucas Aerospace ended up producing the faulty sensors that went into the Boeing 737 MAX planes that nosedived out of the sky. So for me, this is just really illustrative of the choice that we face as a society. It's not between markets or states. It's between this model of centralized, authoritarian, top-down planning that brings together the public and private sector, or decentralized, democratic planning with a view to producing socially useful goods. Social democratic parties have really lost their way in recent years. I think this is due to a number of different issues. The first one is obviously their timidity when it comes to tackling issues like inequality, for example. So, when we live in a cost of living crisis where workers' incomes are stagnating at the same time as we have, just astonishing rates of inequality and wealth at the very top of society, naturally people are angry, and they're angry at our political class for failing to really do anything about that. The kind of social democratic parties of the left that were in power in the 1990s, in the UK it was New Labour. One of the kind of senior figures within the New Labour project was famous for saying that he was intensely relaxed about people getting extremely rich. This was the attitude that a lot of social democratic parties had. It was basically that as long as the economy is growing, it doesn't really matter who has a bigger slice of the cake, how big inequality is, how significant inequality is. All that matters is that everyone is seeing their income increase bit by bit. And of course, that was all facilitated by this huge economic bubble that we had before the financial crisis of 2008, that meant that everyone was seeing their house price increase, everyone was seeing their pension, the value of their pension increase. Lots of people had all sorts of investments in financial markets that seemed to be going up and up and up forever. Gordon Brown declared the end of boom and bust. They had, figured out a way to manage the monetary system, the economy, that meant that we wouldn't have boom and bust anymore. Of course, this all turned out to be a huge illusion, and it all collapsed during the financial crisis of 2008, often being blamed on those same social democratic parties. And we entered this period of stagnation. That is the point at which this model of, it doesn't matter if some people are getting intensely rich, as long as everyone else is seeing their income increase, that breaks down, because we no longer have the kind of growth that allows people to have continuous increases in their living standards whilst those at the top get very, very rich. We've had this really significant stagnation in productivity. We've had, pretty disappointing growth rates across much of the rich world. Instead, what we've seen is a greater share of income going to those at the top, and particularly a greater share of wealth accruing to those at the top, whilst many other people are left behind. When you add in all of these other trends that are putting pressure on our capacity to produce things as a global economy, the main one actually being climate breakdown, which is causing this long-term pressure on food prices, you see working people trapped between stagnant wages, stagnant productivity, and rising costs on the other hand. And they blame often social democratic parties for failing to do anything about that. So it's really no wonder that trust in those parties has fallen to really low levels. But I also think there's something a bit deeper going on here, right? I don't think there is a straight line that runs through economic dislocation through to rising support for the far right. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. And part of the problem, I believe, is that left parties do not understand the importance of the concentrations of power and the way in which that has stripped agency and control from so many people in our society. So when you live in an economy in which all of the most important decisions that affect your life are being taken somewhere else by someone else with no accountability, you're going to end up feeling disempowered. And this is exactly the kind of economy we live in. As I've argued in the book, it's characterized by this pervasive cooperation planning between those at the very top in the public and private sector. And it means everyone else is left just basically adrift, feeling the impact of other people's decisions and unable to really have a sense of agency or control in their own lives. It leaves people feeling extremely disempowered. Now, historically, those people would have been involved in, something like the labor movement, or they would have had community organizations that could have allowed them to support each other and protect one another. And that would have given them a sense of power and control. But in the 1980s, another thing that social democratic parties allowed to happen was the destruction of those forms of collective power, the destruction of the labor movement, the atomization of society. So in the book, I write how, through that period, we saw the transition from people being described as workers to the ideal subject being an entrepreneur. So people are no longer workers, they're mini entrepreneurs. People are no longer members of a community, they're part of households. They're no longer citizens, they're consumers of public services. This transition towards a highly individualistic society where we are all on our own and we're all competing to survive because we allegedly live in this free market economy, but it's not a free market for those at the top. It's just ruthless competition for those at the bottom. That amplifies these feelings of disempowerment, of alienation, of dislocation. And that is what I think actually is really pushing people towards the far right. It's the sense that they don't have any power and control over their own lives, that they are watching as these huge social trends, economic, political trends play out, and they have no influence. No matter who they vote for, nothing changes. They're not able to influence the way that the company where they work operates. They're not able to influence really any of the big decisions that affect them and how they live. And that really encourages this rage and this desire to literally take back control. That was the slogan of the Brexit referendum in the UK. It was people saying, I want control and power back over my life. And when a figure like Trump or Farage or Le Pen or whoever comes in and says, vote for me, I will make you strong again, I will make you feel powerful again, people then project their agency onto that strong leader. And they say, this guy is going to literally do what he's saying. He's going to make me feel powerful again. He's going to give me a sense of control and agency in my life. And the left has missed that. We've really missed the importance of giving people a sense of power and agency and control. And it requires rebuilding the forms of collective power that once allowed working people to come together and really figure this stuff out collectively. So the world that we're living in today is characterized by some theorists have called a polycrisis, right? We have climate breakdown, we have economic stagnation, we have the erosion of democracy. We also have trends that seem to be challenging our economic model, challenging our political model, things like the growth of AI and the big tech companies. We have rising inequality, there's greater geopolitical tension and fragmentation, obviously characterized by this huge, great power conflict that is emerging between the US and China, but also all of the really significant regional upsets that are taking place, whether in Gaza, in Ukraine, across much of Africa. We are living in a world of profound conflict, which is not what a lot of people expected. Back in the 1990s, we had this end of history moment when, we were told that history had stopped because capitalism and liberal democracy had won and there wouldn't be too much conflict anymore. This would just be, all these different countries converging on this same kind of Western model. And that's just been proven to be completely and utterly untrue, primarily due to the rise of the Chinese model. Now, I write a little bit about the Chinese model in my book because we have this dichotomized way of thinking where we see American capitalism on the one hand and Chinese state capitalism on the other hand. And people say America has free markets and democracy, and China has kind of either state capitalism or state socialism, depending on how you view it, and authoritarianism. And I argue in the book that these two systems are not as different as most people would like to believe. Both of these systems are characterized by a small number of extraordinarily powerful large corporations which influence the direction of innovation, influence production, jobs creation, etc. And states that work with those corporations to really determine the priorities of that particular nation, alongside powerful financial systems that also play a really significant role. Now, there are big differences, of course. In China, the financial system is entirely controlled by the state. In the Chinese economy, the decision-making process works very differently. The balance of power between the public and private sector is somewhat different. But even in the US, you have had, in an allegedly free market system, constant bailouts of big corporations, constant bailouts of the financial sector, very clear direction from government to the corporate sector as to where they should be producing things, how they should be producing things. Even now, we have Trump taking a 10% stake in Intel, in the alleged bastion of free market democracy. People think that this is a kind of erosion of American capitalism, but I would argue it is fundamental to how American capitalism works. Elon Musk being in the White House, right? But again, this isn't the first time that a billionaire has been in the White House. It's not the first time that an extremely wealthy person from the corporate sector has been brought into the US state to make policy. Trump made Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, his Secretary of State in his first term. So all of these alleged huge differences between the US and China, I actually, think they can be boiled down to a question of scale and of the balance of power. They're not completely different models. Both of them rely on a form of centralized planning. They rely on cooperation between huge multinational corporations, the finance sector and the public sector to basically determine how we produce things and who gets what. And that is the same across both of those societies. However, there is not room for two hegemons in a global capitalist system, especially one that has been dominated by one superpower for such a long time. So this conflict is not actually the result of two completely opposing economic models. It is the result of a conflict for power in an economy in which, really, in terms of when we're thinking about what makes that system stable, there can only be one major hegemon. So as you said, we're moving into a world of multipolarity. We're moving into a world in which, the role of the dollar ceases to be so universally significant and will instead be challenged by a number of other currencies. We're moving into a world which will be characterized by greater levels of conflict, by different patterns of trade and investment. I would argue also by continuing relative stagnation. If you look at the trends in productivity and growth over the last kind of decade or so and compare that to the kind of pre-2008 period, it's a completely different world. And even the growth that we have seen since the financial crisis, so much of that has been driven by China, and that is not going to continue to be sustainable forever. So there's this world of conflict, of stagnation. We've got climate breakdown on the horizon as well, which is again challenging our capacity to produce the basic things that we need to survive. And we cannot continue to just do more of the same. I know that in Europe, where we are now, there is this debate, and in some ways it's been resolved. Do we stick with kind of free market capitalism, which never really existed, or do we kind of try and follow the Chinese model and create these big, powerful champions that can compete with their Chinese and American competitors? And we're already seeing Europe converge on that model, basically saying, we need more monopolies, right? We need less accountability in the economy. And the US is obviously also going down the same path. It is, understandable from within the framework I lay out about how capitalism works. I don't think this is a really significant change, but I don't think it's the answer to the problems that we face for all the reasons that I've laid out. If we're talking about the problems that we're seeing with democracy, then the creation of yet more huge, powerful corporations in cahoots with governments that have very little accountability to the population is not going to make people feel like they have more power or control over their lives. Equally, governments failing to really do anything about issues like climate breakdown, failing to resolve these problems around geopolitics, many of which are intimately linked to the dynamics of trade in fossil fuels. That is only going to exacerbate the cost of living crisis over the long term. I really believe that instead of having political leaders focused on playing great power politics and trying to make their nation or their region the greatest in the world, we need to have leaders who are responsive to the needs of ordinary people. And that's not what our political class wants to hear. If you speak to a politician, they want to make their career by doing something great, by delivering a peace accord, by, building the economy and growing investment and basically augmenting their power by augmenting the power of the state. And that is not what people really need. People need the basics of their lives provided for. We need better public services. We need good jobs with good pay. We need a stronger labor movement. We need action on climate. All of these things that don't seem glamorous, don't seem exciting, and don't seem to make you a great statesman. But if we lived in a real democracy, those are the kinds of challenges that our politicians would actually be talking about. I am always hopeful. I remain hopeful, and I believe it is the duty of a socialist to be hopeful. And that's because the way that the world works is not fixed or predetermined. It emerges from the way that we think about things. If we believe that this system is just designed to kind of continue repressing and exploiting and extracting, and there's absolutely nothing we can do about it, then we bring that world into being. But if we come to realize that actually our entire economy, our entire political system, the legitimacy of those institutions, of those systems, rests on our consent, rests on the things that we believe, the things that we choose to do, then we immediately become immensely powerful. This was actually, in the book, I argue that the whole neoliberal transformation of the 1980s, it didn't have anything to do with creating free markets or shrinking the state. That was what they told us. They said, the state's got too big, we're going to shrink it and give you more freedom. That's absolutely not what happened, really, anywhere in the world. What the neoliberal transformation was about was crushing collective power, because people had realized that they were strong enough to start taking control over their lives. You saw this in the UK with the strength of the labour movement, all around the world with the anti-apartheid movement, the peace movement, the environmental movement. There is a French sociologist called Grégoire Chamaillou who wrote this book, The Ungovernable Society. And his argument is that what happened in the 1980s was that politicians realized that they had lost control, that they were, ruling over ungovernable societies because of all this collective power, because of all these links between people who were coming together in their workplaces, in their communities, on the streets, and saying, we demand a different model. So the neoliberal transformation wasn't about creating free markets. It was about beating back these popular movements that were threatening transformation. And it did so very successfully. The labor movement was crushed. Most states became more centralized. So, these popular movements had much less power. Protest movements were often crushed. And we ended up, as I said, in this kind of highly individualistic society without that sense of collective power that allows people to challenge the system. But the fact that we got so close so recently to having the levels of kind of solidarity that are required for true economic and political transformation is for me a real source of hope, because I think we can get there again. And I actually think we can do it better, because a lot of these institutions in the 1970s were still quite top down, quite hierarchical, not necessarily very focused. Today, I really believe, I speak to people all over the world in different kinds of social movements, in the climate movement, in the democracy movement, the peace movement, the labor movement, and they are doing incredible things everywhere to challenge the power and authority of those at the top. Whether it is, the Chilean communities that are coming together to resist the new data centers being built by the big tech companies that threaten to take all of their drinking water. Whether it is workers in the US in Starbucks coming together and forming a new union from the ground up. Whether it's the small community that I visited in North Wales that's decided to take control over its local energy system. Everywhere you look, people are reforming these bonds of solidarity. And the moment that we stop viewing the world as this competition between all these isolated individual little people, the moment we stop viewing society as a market and start seeing the ways in which we can come together and collaborate, is the moment that things start to change. I think on the left for a long time, there's been this debate as to whether we should prioritize, economic or cultural issues, right? And there's this new trend that I see a lot of people saying, well, for the left to win, you need to, stop, being positive about migration and start picking up the right's attack lines on things like migration, on cultural issues, whilst having a left-wing economic program. I have come to realize how deeply flawed that way of thinking is relatively recently. Everywhere you look, where the left adopts this strategy of right on culture, left on economics, they only ever end up empowering the far right. And there is a very, very clear and obvious reason for that. There's only room for one real political cleavage, one political battle line in society. And when you invest time and energy in reinforcing the idea that the big divide in society is between native-born people and migrant, then that is the divide that you strengthen. That becomes the way that everyone thinks about politics. So when they can't get a house it's the fault of immigrants. When they can't get a job, it's the fault of immigrants. When they can't afford things in the shops, it's the fault of immigrants. As long as you're centering that issue, that is going to be the thing that people think about. This is why I just fundamentally do not believe that this is a workable strategy for the left. We have to refocus people's understanding of the society in which we live away, actually, I would argue, from all of these cultural issues, and refocus on how we produce things, how the economy works, and show that the reason you can't afford a house is because all the social housing has been sold off and bought up by big property companies that then charge you massively high rents, and there's no regulation in the private rented sector, and foreign investors own half of London, right? This is a question of inequality. Equally, the reason that you can't put food on the table is because there is this massive inequality of power between you as a worker and your boss and the shareholders who are taking home vast sums of money. There was a statistic the other day that 50% of consumption in the US is driven by the top 10% of people. The top 10% is doing 50% of the consuming in American society. That's staggering. And it also drives up prices for everyone else. So all of these issues, we need to talk about them in terms of issues of power and inequality. And instead of saying, take out your rage on people that you consider to be weak because it makes you feel strong, we need to instead be helping people to figure out how they can take back control by learning to work together.